I get a lot of feedback from parents who express a lot of concern about either their child has been recently diagnosed or they suspect their child is on the autism spectrum, and they know they would like to begin doing therapeutic supports, but either they're not available in their area or they're on the waiting list for those. And so the 8 activities that we're going to talk about today are things that I have found through my 20 years of working with folks on the spectrum are effective for all ages. There are things that you can do at home with no or minimal types of supplies or investment. And the teens and adults that I work with have given their stamp of approval for these activities. So the first one that we're going to start with is deep breathing. And I have chosen this picture in particular because I have a group that is run weekly with teens and adults. And they actually have chosen this particular technique. And so we have this image here shows that there's a woman who's actually breathing in, putting her hands up, and then she will pull them down towards her side. And this is the one that my autistic teens and adults have found is most effective for them. Now, one thing that you are going to find is really interesting about deep breathing. Anyone, anywhere can participate in this activity at any age and any functioning level. And the research is very clear that it actually will lower cortisol levels. That's cortisol is the stress hormone. And so we know it has a physiological effect on the body. This is something you can teach even little children. When my youngest was 3 or 4, I started teaching him this technique, and he knows now to go ahead and do it. Essentially, what we know with folks on the spectrum and anyone who has anxiety is that we tend to breathe very shallow when we're anxious, and we tend to tense up our muscles. So just, being mindful of going ahead and breathing deeply into your lungs actually helps to relieve some of that stress and anxiety. So, and it's something anybody can do anywhere. Nature walks are something else that has been shown scientifically to help with both stress and depression. And actually, several years ago, when I was working with an 11-year-old who was having some suicidal thoughts, and he was going to traditional therapy, I was pulled in to work with the young man, and I started taking him on nature walks. And it was really very clear right away that it was calming to him, and the perseverative thoughts that he was having, those thoughts that just go over and over and over again in his mind, would go away when we would go on these walks. So ever since then, that is something that I have definitely used with a lot of the folks that I work with to help them get to a better mental space. And what's nice about this is that we know that it doesn't take very long. It can take, just 5 minutes, 10 minutes of a walk in a place that's really soothing and relaxing can really have those kinds of benefits that research shows in terms of alleviating anxiety and depression. So that's another real simple thing you can do. And, if you have one of those kids, which a lot of our autistic kids are this way, where they want to do something for 5 minutes and then they're done. My daughter was that way. We would go someplace and right away she's like, I'm finished, let's go home. And everybody else was like, oh, we just got here. But even just a really brief walk in a peaceful, serene environment can make the difference. And the one thing I would caution people about in doing nature walks is to just be mindful of a person's sensory issues. For example, my daughter was not able to go where there were locusts singing. So at night, in really heavily treed areas was not a good place for her. And a lot of the people that I work with are not really particularly comfortable on a windy beach because of the sand and the wind. So I find that green kind of cooler areas are better for the nature walks. Self-massage is something else that we can teach anyone who is functioning at any level, anywhere, anytime. They can use this. And what I hear from my teens and adults who use this is that just giving your body a little squeeze can help alleviate some of the achiness that they have in their muscles and their joints, which can be kind of an ongoing low level pressure that they experience. And so just going ahead and either before you see a situation where your child might be getting feeling anxious or getting upset or in a stressful situation, or during that time, going ahead and giving them the prompt and teaching them how to just give themselves a nice big hug. You can do this standing in line at the grocery store. You can do it at home. If you're at home and you want to take this a level further, of course, weighted blankets as well as weighted vests can do much of the same thing. A lot of our younger kids like to be rolled up into a blanket, and you can just kind of give them a gentle squeeze and help them with their self-massage. But really what I like about self-massage is it really teaches that skill for them moving forward independently. So whether you're there or not, if they're learning this skill, then they're able to actually do it whether you're there or not. And that's really important. I like to see that happening. Another really neat and easy thing to do is to get your child involved with pets. This is my daughter and her emotional support dog, Mika. And Mika is there to remind her when Diana starts to get anxious. Mika will actually take her little nose and put it on her chest until Diana realizes, oh, I'm feeling anxious and I need to ratchet it down. And the neat thing about therapy dogs and emotional support animals is that they can do a wide variety of things, from waking a person up in the morning to just being with them, a person to just help calm them down and help them feel more relaxed and secure. The research shows that actually petting a dog lowers a person's stress hormone cortisol pretty significantly, so that takes off the edge of the stress, and it increases a person's oxytocin, or what we refer to as our love hormone, that feeling of caring and empathy. So if you have pets, this is a great thing to just make sure that your child is getting exposure to a pet and being able to pet them. The other thing that I found is that families who have fish tanks or hamsters that run around in wheels, those can be very soothing and relaxing for people as well. And just keep in mind, we're looking at all of these activities that we're talking about today. They stand alone on their own as being very useful, but they also really will help to prepare your child for any kind of formal or traditional therapy that they're going to be getting, because we know once a person is kind of removed from that anxious state into a calm and soothed and relaxed, they are more likely going to be better learners. They're going to be able to pay attention better. They're going to be able to communicate better. They're going to be able to understand better. So these are all things that you can start doing now. And once you get those traditional therapies in place, I really recommend using these in conjunction with your traditional therapies. So another really helpful tool is to explore your child's sensory experiences with them. What I have found often is parents have the urge to get rid of sensory exploration rather than exploring it. So, if your child is flipping light switches off and on, or rocking back and forth, or opening and shutting things, or sniffing everything in the grocery store from soap to, going out and sniffing rocks on the ground. The urge often is to stop that. But what I have found is if you explore this in a really positive way, it can also help with the learning process in terms of easing anxiety if you find the right kinds of sensory exploration for your particular situation. And it can also help with the learning because you can pair that with language. And then for those of you who maybe have children who have sensory aversions, allowing your child to explore those sensory experiences where they are acceptable sensory experiences that are similar to ones that they like, it really broadens their perspective and gives them the ability to learn. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more in detail. So, for example, if a child is flipping light switches, that's probably not a helpful experience for you or for them. However, there's something about that motion that they're doing, either because it's, they're liking to watch the lights or the fans, or they're liking that repetitive motion. So the idea is to find out what is it that your child is really drawn to sensorially, and then figure out things they can do to get that need met. I've always found that kids on the spectrum really do self-treat. So if they're flipping light switches or spinning around and around or rocking back and forth or smelling things, they are actually doing that to fulfill a need or a purpose in their lives. And so, if your child's a sniffer, goes and sniffs everything, I recommend that you find a variety of things that are acceptable for them to explore in this way. And, I have a young man who years ago was one of those kids who just sniff everything, books, papers, pens. And so we started to explore different kinds of things. Like you see the picture of the young man here who's sniffing herbs. And we found particular scents that were really soothing and calming to him. And he learned that instead of breaking things when he was feeling anxious or angry, he would go and look for his special packet of scents that we had put together. And he would go and find that and sit and smell the scents in his bag as an alternative to doing destructive kinds of activities. And so that's something I find is very useful. And there's a lot of talk, I think, right now about like different things like lava lamps or lights that people can use. Swings are something that, you see a lot of people talking about swings for kids on the spectrum. But one of the areas where I see people don't always focus on is sound and vibration. And I find with a lot of the individuals that I work with that sound and vibration of the right sort can be incredibly soothing for them. Oftentimes it's lower, deeper kinds of vibrations that are really positive. And so I really encourage families to explore with your child if certain musical instruments, like maybe a violin or a cello. I work with a lot of kids who absolutely love the drums, and they really just can get into the rhythms and the sounds of the drums, and it's a very soothing experience. And I actually know some autistic kids who started out, playing with the drums because it was soothing to them when they were little, and they're in their, in their teens. And some of those guys are actually really good drummers and belong to bands and have made it into something that potentially could be, a really good hobby moving forward, and in some of their cases, maybe a career. So another really interesting kind of thing that you can use for those people who like the low, deep vibrations is something called a singing bowl. And this has a really nice low, these bigger bronze singing bowls have a really nice vibration that you can actually feel it vibrating on your body when you touch it. and it makes a really nice sound that some of the folks that I've encountered really love these bigger, deep-sounding singing bowls and find them to be very therapeutic. What we like to see is for any of those behaviors that are destructive or harmful, or even just maybe are going to be getting in the way of a person being accepted by their peers or socializing effectively. Oftentimes we can take those sensory experiences and find something like a singing bowl or a drum, which actually can be an inclusive kind of an activity instead. So I know my kids who do the drums, that's been a really good way to encourage social interactions with other young people, because you know, what kid isn't, you know, fascinated and interested in a person who plays the drums. Tuning forks are something that I've seen also. This is a tuning fork, and you just kind of strike it and it makes a vibration which you won't be able to hear on the video. It's a low vibration, and you can either feel it in your body, or you can put it up to your ear and hear a nice low vibration. So experimenting with sound is definitely a very helpful kind of thing to do with a lot of our folks, and it's one of the areas that I often see people don't think about when they're looking at addressing sensory experiences. You know, 20 years ago when I started, nobody was talking about the sensory challenges that our folks have, and today I'm really pleased to see that people are aware of how that affects our kids, and that people are really, you know, making choices about children's environments and doing things like getting the swings in place, and that really does help. But don't forget the sounds and the scents. So our next tip is to, instead of telling your child about something you want them to do or a skill that you'd like them to learn, I have found often that if you put that particular series of steps or that activity that you want them to do to a simple song, that our kids on the spectrum do really well. There's something about, I think it's a different part of the brain that activates the music sensibilities in us. And so some kids who may have trouble following your just verbal instruction or learning from a verbal standpoint may actually do well if you sing. So for example, you can just take a kid's song for your younger ones. You could just, you know, say, this is the way we fold the clothes, fold the clothes, fold the clothes, and model it, and then go ahead and help them do what you're doing. But have them often, they'll often sing along or hum when they wouldn't necessarily verbalize that. So that's, I found, a really useful way to experiment with teaching kids new skills. For your teens and adults who are pretty, you know, those really bright young people who maybe have a lot of verbal expressive skills already, I've also found that for some of them, background music can be really helpful to help them focus. And so you maybe don't necessarily want to have it be completely quiet for those guys. So choosing music that is soothing and relaxing for your teen or adult on the spectrum can really help them focus in and listen to what you have to say as well. So you can take this technique and use it for your little ones by singing with them and doing the kid songs, or you can utilize it as a music as a background sound to help our older ones who have the really good language. The next tip I want to talk about is identifying and labeling emotions. I know that some therapists really encourage, if you have a child who has a meltdown or breaks something or does something that is, you know, is considered to be socially not acceptable, a lot of therapists recommend that we just ignore those behaviors. And the issue that I have with ignoring them is that, as we know, folks on the spectrum uh, do often have an issue identifying their feelings, identifying other people's feelings, um, and knowing what to do with them when they have them. So what I do instead of ignoring is I will actually point it out. So if I've got a 5-year-old who throws his train, I'll say, "You a grumpy? You grumpy?" And I'll actually prompt them to say, "I'm grumpy," so that they can begin to pair that language by hearing me say it, and also if they're ready and willing and able, saying it themselves. Um, and what we find is that, our kids on the spectrum will, chances are, require a lot more practice than the typical kid to make that connection. But the more that you expose them to those experiences, both those feelings that are feel-good feelings and the icky feelings, um, be getting them exposed to the words that go with how they're feeling. So if they're grumpy, if they're happy, if they're sad, if they're excited, if they're nervous, you know label those. And then as kids get older, in their teens and adults, what I find oftentimes is, at the moment when a person is feeling anxious is maybe not the time to identify that. But later on, for those guys who have really good language, you can go back and say, I noticed we were at the grocery store and you looked kind of anxious. How are you, feeling yesterday when we were there? And let's talk about it. And that gives them the time to go ahead and process it. So the more and the earlier exposure our kids get to concepts of emotions, the better. And this can be a really fun activity where you can actually go online or go into books and get pictures like the one I have here of this sad baby crying, and be able to show images to your child and get them to be able to label them in pictures of other kids if they're ready for that. I do that actually with a lot of the teens that I work with and the adults I work with who have trouble reading emotions. We actually will look at videos of people expressing emotions, and we'll look at pictures of people expressing emotions, and we'll talk about it. And we try to do that for anyone who has trouble with emotions. I try to do that as much as possible, because what I've found in my experience working with folks on the spectrum is that, I've seen them grow up from being, 5 or 6 or 8 into young men and women. And oftentimes it takes them a while to get it, but they do get it. They actually eventually it will fall into place, and they'll be able to sometimes actually get these concepts. It just may take a bit longer. For those of you who have kids who are big readers, reading through books and stories with them and being able to label those feelings in stories is a really good idea. And what you may find, and I'm thinking of, my daughter again, she read the Harry Potter series like 9 times, each of those books. And she particularly focused on a scene between 2 characters that she just read over and over and over again. And then she finally came to me and she said, "Mom, I think I know what loyalty is now." And I was like, "Well, tell me what happened." And she said, "I read that scene in Harry Potter about Harry and his best buddy, and I finally get it. It's when you stick by your friends and you feel a sense of wanting to stay with them and help and support them, no matter what." And so she read that book over a period of 5 or 6 years before she actually got it to sink in. So don't give up on your kids if they're not picking up on some of these concepts early on. At the early stages, really what you're doing is just giving them exposure. And so it's not like you have to see some major outcome early on. It's just giving them the opportunities to see and hear and think about these concepts. And that's really what's important, especially early on and even as they get older, because each of our kids comes into their own realizations at their own time. So be patient with them and know that it takes time. And the final technique that I want to share with you is one that, interestingly, I've had a lot of adults come back to me and say that when somebody in their life actually entered their world and did what they did, mirrored them, whether it was with their play or their mannerisms or their expressions, that was a very profound experience for them. And it gave them a sense of feeling close to that person and feeling a sense of a relationship that maybe they hadn't felt before. And I think a lot of times there's a lot of pressure on parents to have their kids behave normally, whatever that is. And so when you have a child who's on the spectrum, a big piece of the therapy is focused on getting compliance, which is, to get your child to behave like all the other kids. And what my adults say is that what's really got their attention was when somebody did what they did. Like they were paying attention and they noticed. And so if you've got a child who lines up their trucks instead of, vrooming them around the floor, line up trucks with your child and see what they do. If they're, flicking their fingers in front of their eyes, try it. See what it's like to do that and see if you can get a feel for, what is it, what is that experience that your child is having, and what's the draw or the appeal for them. And in doing this, oftentimes you'll create a connection that will allow that relationship to foster. And so this is definitely something that that I recommend parents do, is to watch closely what your child's doing and do it with them. If they are playing by opening and closing a lid, open and close a lid with them. And it's really interesting how you can learn some really fascinating things about your child when you are willing to enter their world in this way. So these are the 8 kind of activities that I've chosen to share with you today. And I want to emphasize again, these are all activities that you can do in conjunction with your traditional therapies if you have them. And some of these activities are actually really good to do right before a child goes into a therapy. Like, let's say your child has speech therapy, or they have physical therapy or ABA therapy. So if you can, for example, practice deep breathing before they go into that session, or get them out for a little walk, that's really going to set the tone and the mood for them and get them in a space where they are really going to make the most out of their therapy. Those of you who do have occupational therapy for your young ones, sensory integration occupational therapy, I'll recommend that is something you do right before speech therapy or before physical therapy or before ABA therapy. In most cases, if you do some kind of physical activity before a therapeutic one or a classroom type activity, it's really remarkable sometimes how much better a child is ready to focus and sit down and learn. There are some kids who, if you start them with a physical activity, it just wires them up. And it's like the more you try to get them worn out, the more they just continue to ratchet up their energy and get really just overstimulated. So that would be the only kind of caution I would have about that is, if your child is one who gets overstimulated with physical activity, then you would not want to pair their therapy necessarily with with physical activity beforehand. But if your child is not one of those kids who gets riled up, then that would be an excellent kind of strategy to set up your physical activity first, and then your speech therapy, or then your school, or your ABA therapy. So thank you for joining me today. Let's see if there are any questions.
Yes, I do. So my question was, if a child is unwilling to do one of these, let's say, go walk outside, but you know it's going to be enormously beneficial to them, how can you help them try it, or see that it will make them feel better?
Sure. So what I recommend in those cases is that you choose one of these activities that they are most likely going to be drawn to and start there. So like, there are those kids who just really don't want to be outside. And actually we know that a lot of our kids have, you know, vitamin and mineral deficiencies because of their eating habits, or because they don't want to go out in the sun. And that could be, you know, they may have sensory issues just being out in the sun. But one of the things that I have found is, if you give them some choice about which ones they want to do, and choose the one that really interests them. So, for example, instruments are something that a lot of our kids are really drawn to, and it's something that they can do sitting in the house. So I would start with something that they're more likely to be willing to be engaged in, before I would even try to get somebody who's resistive to going outside. And so there are a lot of activities that you can do inside that actually will give you a physical workout. So being outside, part of that is the nature is relaxing, but part of that is you're actually circulating your blood. And so if you've got, you know, a lot of our kids like music and would like to dance, or if they're willing to practice the deep breathing,